What if the biggest threat to the US isn't invasion, but imitation? Not a war started by tanks or missiles, but by a video. And a lie. A deepfake so convincing it didn't just mislead, it fractured a country. This isn't a war from the history books. It's faster, digital, unpredictable, and just as bloody. This is what a US civil war would look like in 2025. The video hit the eastern seaboard at 6:03 a.m. on a Wednesday, leaked from an encrypted European message board. It made its way onto several American political forums. Then it exploded. X, YouTube, Telegram. Within a few minutes, millions had seen it. The setting was unmistakable. The Supreme Court bench, framed by American flags and cold marble columns. At the center sat the Chief Justice, flanked by silent justices, reading aloud what appeared to be a historic ruling. In a calm, authoritative tone, he declared emergency federal control over all state elections, a sweeping power grab that sent shockwaves through the political landscape. The video was just under 2 minutes long. It looked real, it sounded real, and perhaps most dangerously of all, it felt real. Because for many Americans, the content of that video didn't seem far-fetched. It felt inevitable. The court had, in fact, heard a major case just 2 weeks earlier, centered around emergency federal powers concerning government layoffs and state election protocols. The case had been fast-tracked following a high-profile standoff between the Department of Justice and the state of California. Rumors had swirled for days that a ruling was imminent. When the video dropped, it didn't seem out of place. The timeline matched, the docket number looked authentic. Even seasoned members of the press pool believed that this might be an early unofficial leak. By 6:07, it had been reposted over 80,000 times. At 6:11, hashtag Article 4 trended across every major social media platform. By 6:15, armed groups in Idaho, Georgia, and northern Michigan were already mobilizing. Online forums lit up with claims that this was a second Patriot Act, where others celebrated it as a long-awaited end to state nullification. Across the country, people already full of distrust and resentment became defensive, suspicious, and braced for impact. Then came the second video. At 7:08 a.m., a new broadcast appeared on Signal, then Telegram, then Truth Social. The governor of California appeared on screen, seated behind his desk at the state capitol. He looked composed, deliberate, and resolute. In a calm but defiant tone, he announced that California did not recognize the Supreme Court's ruling. It was, he said, a violation of the constitutional rights of the people. The state would be forming a coalition for constitutional restoration, inviting other states to join in resisting federal overreach. He ended with a chilling declaration: any federal incursion without legislative approval would be treated as unlawful. Within 30 minutes, the video had racked up more than 20 million views. But there was one problem. Both videos were fake. The source was traced to a previously unknown group operating on the darknet and secure foreign servers. They were believed to be a hybrid of rogue domestic actors and foreign contractors with access to next-generation AI video generation tools. But this wasn't the usual AI slop. There were no lip-sync glitches, no uncanny valley stares, no telltale digital seams. This was synthetic footage indistinguishable from reality, built with access to proprietary modeling datasets and advanced voice cloning tools far beyond consumer-grade capabilities. Lip movements synced with breath patterns. Micro-expressions matched each speaker's known tics. Background audio recreated courtroom acoustics and ambient rustle. One metadata analyst would later admit it looked more authentic than the real thing. It took nearly 2 hours before the Supreme Court issued a formal statement denying the video's authenticity. By then, it was too late. Dozens of local officials had already issued statements. Militias had formed roadblocks outside of state houses. Some police departments announced that they would not comply with the DOJ. Others pledged allegiance to the emergency order. The White House's first response was a single-line press release: "No such ruling has been issued by the Supreme Court. We are investigating the source of the unauthorized video." In the months leading up to the war, the State Department had been issuing quiet warnings. AI-generated videos impersonating the Secretary of State were already targeting foreign officials. At the time, it seemed novel, even amusing. But this wasn't amusing. This was weaponized unreality. For 48 hours, the United States no longer had a single reality. Domestic life itself had become a digital illusion. Within minutes of the fake Supreme Court ruling's release, confusion gripped every level of government. Local law enforcement flooded federal channels with questions. Was this legitimate? Did it require immediate enforcement? Could they act on a ruling that hadn't been formally published? But there was no clear answer. The military too was split. Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington State delayed all operations, pending confirmation from higher command. Meanwhile, Fort Hood in Texas received unofficial orders from the Pentagon to prepare for domestic deployment. But when a division commander refused to act without clarification from civilian leadership, and civilian leadership had not agreed on what was real, operational paralysis set in. The National Guard, controlled by state governors, fractured along political lines. In red states, some units swore to uphold the federal directive. In blue states, others denounced it as a constitutional fraud. By mid-morning, governors across the country began convening emergency sessions. Each meeting took on a life of its own. Colorado's governor called for calm and demanded an investigation. Florida's governor praised the court's courage to act in a time of national crisis. There was no coordinated response, only a widening divide. The White House, already reeling from its early morning statement, scrambled to seize back control of the narrative. At 11 a.m., the press secretary stepped behind a visibly unsteady podium and addressed the nation. The Chief Justice wasn't in the country. The ruling was clearly fake. There had been no federal seizure of state authority. But it was too late. The internet had already moved on. Tech platforms, unprepared for the speed and scale of the deepfake spread, struggled to respond. YouTube removed the video only after 2 million views. X flagged it as potentially manipulated but left it up. Telegram ignored it. Deepfake detection systems were slow to react. By the time independent analysis confirmed the footage was fake, the clips had already cemented themselves as gospel inside digital echo chambers. Conspiracy groups jumped on it. Message boards and podcasts claimed that it was part of the long-term plan. Some claimed the deepfake was real and the denials were part of the deception. Others believed the video was part of a false flag operation, a plot staged by the feds to provoke civil unrest and justify a power grab. For believers on either side, the only proof required was that their enemies were panicking. By nightfall, the first blood was drawn. In rural Oregon, a standoff between a county sheriff's department and a National Guard convoy erupted after the sheriff refused to allow federal agents to access a communications tower. When negotiations broke down, gunfire rang out. 2 National Guardsmen and 1 deputy were injured before the convoy withdrew. That night, the sheriff live-streamed a defiant statement saying a line in the sand had been drawn. The video reached 5 million views in 6 hours, and the line, already blurred, was gone. Week 1. By the end of the first week, the United States had split, both formally and functionally. The Department of Justice responded with force, at least on paper. It issued a sweeping set of arrest warrants targeting state officials accused of, quote, subverting federal authority and promoting insurrection. The list was like a who's who of political defiance. Secretaries of state from California, Oregon, and New York, governors, and even multiple state Supreme Court justices. But the orders were ignored, or worse, laughed off. No U.S. Marshals attempted enforcement. There were no doors kicked in or arrests because, in many states, there was no one left willing to carry them out. Inside the military, the chain of command fractured. The Joint Chiefs issued guidance urging constitutional clarity, but lower-level commanders weren't waiting for instructions. Some activated regional logistics hubs to, quote, ensure public order. Others refused federal direction altogether. One general in Georgia began using a private encrypted messaging app to coordinate directly with sympathetic governors, bypassing the Pentagon entirely. The DoD, paralyzed by political crossfire, stopped releasing public statements. The courts fared no better. Federal judges attempted to hold emergency hearings via Zoom, only to be drowned out by denial of service attacks and jurisdictional disputes. In multiple states, federal court rulings were simply not recognized by local authorities. State courts declared themselves the only legitimate arbiters of justice within their borders. Legal scholars called it a constitutional crisis, but in the streets, it felt different. California joined forces with Washington and Illinois to form the Coalition for Constitutional Restoration. Florida made it illegal to disobey federal orders. Texas revived old defense laws to arm civilian militias. From state to state, the laws no longer matched. Your rights depended on where you lived. Major corporations scrambled to adapt to the unfolding situation. Apple and Meta halted operations in Flashpoint regions, citing threats to staff and infrastructure. Amazon moved its warehouses to states aligned with federal authority. The media split overnight. Some networks doubled down on partisan narratives, while others went dark entirely. By the end of the week, the question wasn't if the country was coming apart, it was how far the cracks would go. As America splintered, the information domain became a no man's land of competing realities. Dozens of AI-generated news broadcasts flooded streaming platforms, each claiming to be from credible outlets. One feed showed a uniformed general announcing full military control of the West Coast. Another claimed federal troops had taken over state houses in Tallahassee and Albany. None of it was real, but each video bore network-style lower thirds, familiar faces, even stolen logos. The American public had no way to tell what was real. In Ohio, residents received an emergency shelter-in-place alert at 3:24 a.m. on Thursday. Emergency federal order, shelter in place, do not approach military vehicles, state control deemed compromised. It was a hoax, of course. The system had been hacked. Experts later traced it to an advanced threat group operating out of Russia. But the damage was done. Terrified citizens barricaded themselves in basements while armed militias flooded the roads. The state government was forced to shut down the entire alert system for 72 hours to prevent further manipulation. On social media, chaos reigned. Platforms tried to keep up, but the damage was already done. Dozens of blue-check influencers, pundits, and streamers capitalized on the confusion, proclaiming loyalty to one faction or another. Their follower counts exploded. So did their influence. In a world where trust in institutions was gone, verified voices became digital warlords, wielding audience loyalty like a private army. Encrypted channels on platforms like Signal, Telegram, and Matrix became central nervous systems of the resistance and the rebellion. Armed groups coordinated supply drops, movements, even drone strikes via secure group chats. Private citizens shared evacuation maps, blackout alerts, and emergency first aid PDFs. State actors, foreign and domestic, listened in, spread disinformation, or impersonated key figures. By the end of the first week, one thing was sure: no one was sure who was actually in charge anymore. But problematically, everyone believed someone was. Week 2. By the end of the second week, the old American map was obsolete. There were no official borders, no declarations of independence, no flags raised over state capitals. Not yet. But on the ground, the country now operated in discrete zones, some aligned, some opposed, some simply trying to survive. On the West Coast, a new allegiance emerged. The politically aligned states of California, Oregon, Washington, and Hawaii announced the formation of the Pacific Coalition. In a joint broadcast, their governors declared that they would no longer comply with federal directives unless ratified by their respective legislatures. They invoked what they called the principle of coordinated sovereignty and unveiled a regional security pact to defend their shared interests. West Coast National Guard units were consolidated under regional command. Military bases, ports, and infrastructure were placed under local control. San Francisco became the coalition's nerve center, a digital capital for what some now called Pacifica. In the Southeast and Midwest, a counterweight formed, the Constitutional Alliance, a bloc spearheaded by Texas and Florida, joined by parts of Tennessee, Oklahoma, Indiana, and the Dakotas. These states pledged to uphold constitutional continuity through federal unity and declared support for DOJ authority in the original emergency ruling. Even as its origin remained disputed, Texas reactivated its state guard and began absorbing sympathetic militia groups into formalized command structures. Florida declared control over its ports and coastline in defense of national cohesion. But this wasn't a clean north-south divide. The war wasn't between regions, it was between realities. Urban centers became fortress states. Cities like Atlanta, Phoenix, and St. Louis declared temporary autonomy from their state governments. They formed local councils and citizen militias to control their own police, utilities, and emergency protocols. They weren't blue cities and red states, they were armed micro-nations navigating between collapsing jurisdictions. Some aligned with the Pacific Coalition, others playing both sides, many simply trying to keep the lights on. Meanwhile, the suburbs burned purple. These purple zones became the bloodiest, most unstable regions. In places like central Pennsylvania, northern Virginia, and the outskirts of Dallas, neighborhoods were split by ideology, ethnicity, and trust. PTA groups turned into militia cells. Neighborhood watch groups blockaded intersections. Schools and hospitals flew neutral flags, if they remained open at all. In the chaos, neutral zones emerged. Denver declared itself a diplomatic city-state, refusing to take sides and inviting mediation from international observers. Chicago declared a pause in political alignment and negotiated corridor status for humanitarian convoys. In D.C., foreign embassies closed their gates, fortified their compounds, and waited. Corporations didn't pick sides, they picked servers. Google moved its executive command center to a hardened facility outside Salt Lake City, just east of a booming Silicon Slopes. Amazon split its logistics between Utah and Toronto. A new class of digitally sovereign corporate zones sprang up. Cloud-based strongholds where businesses could continue under artificial governance frameworks enforced by smart contracts and air-gapped data centers. Microsoft's Azure region outside of Cheyenne became a corporate government hybrid with its own militia protection. The Union hadn't declared dissolution, it had simply stopped functioning. Warfare in this new climate of instability proved anything but conventional. In Texas, a National Guard convoy was struck by a swarm of hobbyist drones retrofitted with commercial explosives. In Portland, blackouts began with no warning. 2 substations had been hacked using default manufacturer passwords. In Atlanta, a municipal dam was opened in the middle of the night, flooding a loyalist neighborhood. No one ever claimed responsibility. No one needed to. In 2025, attribution was as good as fiction. Rural militias used guerrilla tactics, ambushes, pipeline sabotage, highway raids. In cities, loyalist forces deployed quadcopters with thermal imaging and facial recognition to hunt known dissidents in alleyways. Armed engagements were fast, fluid, and often one-sided. Most casualties didn't know they were in a war zone until it was too late. 3D-printed guns, grenade launchers, and custom rifle attachments flooded the underground. Hackers released CAD files for printable landmines and anti-drone nets. Surveillance gear was home-brewed. A decent engineering student could build a kill box for under $500. On the propaganda front, AI became a fully operational combatant. Thousands of horrifying variations of the same video, edited for different dialects, regions, and psychological profiles, circulated by the hour. In one version, the federal military was seen liberating a town from armed insurgents. In another, they were massacring civilians. Both were fakes, but were believed. Language was a weapon. Visuals were a payload. Across the country, young digital insurgents armed with tools like Stable Diffusion and GPT-based editors churned out revolutionary manifestos and cinematic call-to-arms videos. It felt more real than anything broadcast on the evening news. This was no longer a war that could be won with tanks or treaties. It was about holding attention, and in a fractured nation where reality had shattered into 1,000 feeds, attention was the most strategic resource of all. In this terrifying new landscape, the military broke first, the government fractured next, then society itself followed. Families split, politically and geographically. A father in Tennessee joined a local Constitutional Alliance militia, while his daughter, studying in Berkeley, volunteered for the Pacific Coalition Civilian Defense Corps. They stopped speaking after a phone call turned into a shouting match over whether the Supreme Court ruling had ever happened. One believed it was fake, the other believed the denial was the real deception. Some tried to remain neutral, packing up, moving to the so-called gray zones in the Mountain West or Upper Midwest. But neutrality had a short shelf life. In Utah, a family fleeing California was turned away at a gas station by an armed volunteer checkpoint. The driver had an old Restore Democracy bumper sticker, and that was enough. Grocery stores were emptied and water became currency. Blackouts were common. Internet outages were weaponized. In some towns, people bartered with canned food and antibiotics. In others, armed guards escorted water trucks between neighborhoods. Local radio returned as the primary news source in many places, if you could find batteries. Underlying it all was a creeping sense of tribalism. It was a divide not only between left and right, but between those who still believed in the idea of a United States and those who no longer thought it ever truly existed. While Americans argued over what was real, the rest of the world didn't wait. Within days of the initial fracture, eager Chinese officials extended an offer of technical and humanitarian assistance to the Pacific Coalition. Officially, it was to help restore disrupted shipping lanes and maintain digital infrastructure. Unofficially, Chinese telecom technicians and logistics personnel began acting on contingency plans and operating out of Oakland and Tacoma. Satellite internet nodes and unmanned surveillance balloons were offered at no cost. The Pacific governors called it a temporary partnership. Washington called it treason. Russia moved faster. Chaos was the bottom line. Payback for years of arms shipments to Ukrainian freedom fighters. Intelligence services began funneling cryptocurrency and weapons to rural insurgent networks in Texas, Appalachia, and the Rust Belt. Russian contractors, many tied to former Wagner elements, appeared in social media footage training local militias under the banner of defensive sovereignty. Russian media outlets branded them as democracy's heroes, resisting an illegitimate digital coup. And as if nobody saw it coming, the United Nations froze. A Security Council resolution to call for mediation failed after both China and Russia issued vetoes. Multiple members proposed recognizing different successor factions: the Pacific Coalition, the Constitutional Alliance, even Denver's self-declared Federal Continuity Council. No consensus formed. Some embassies in Washington evacuated entirely, others fortified and waited. And then came the mercenaries. foreign nationals posing as private security consultants, former NATO soldiers, others from Brazil, Serbia, Turkey, and South Africa offered their services to state legislatures. One convoy of former French Foreign Legionnaires was spotted operating in eastern Colorado, guarding a lithium extraction facility. Global markets unraveled. With the U.S. fractured, the dollar's reserve status fell under scrutiny. Oil contracts began shifting toward the yuan. Stock exchanges in London and Tokyo shed billions in a matter of days. Multinational firms abandoned U.S. operations or moved them offshore. American credibility, military, economic, and diplomatic, collapsed faster than any warhead could have managed. 18 months later, a year and a half after the deepfake ruling that never was, the United States was shattered, unwilling to be pieced back together. Rigid territorial lines had formed. Redrawn zones hardened where supply lines, population loyalty, and armed control overlapped. Some states were split down the middle, others divided into city-states, tribal regions, or corporate protectorates. Movement between territories required passes, bribes, or heavy escort. Maps were updated weekly. None stayed accurate for long. Trade routes became arteries of survival. Control of the highways, rail hubs, and river access determined who had power and who got food, fuel, and medicine. The economy didn't crash. It morphed into something strange. In neutral zones, people traded food, fuel, medicine, and even hard drives. Crypto became the main currency in city enclaves. Some places printed their own money. A can of food might be worth 2 hours of power or a handful of bullets. Tech hubs like Silicon Valley and Austin became walled-off mini-nations, run by CEOs instead of politicians. If you followed their rules, you got security and the internet. If not, you were out. A few cities, like Denver and Chicago, acted as independent city-states, trying to mediate between the warring sides. But no one spoke for the whole country anymore. Everyone was tired. The war, born from a lie, now ran on fear. The toll was massive. 5 million displaced, nearly 300,000 dead, not from battles, but from chaos. The old America still lived in memories, but peace, that was something ordinary people stopped believing in. Okay, but could something like this actually happen? Check out Could the United States Have Another Civil War? To see if it's even on the table, or click on this video instead.